The fluorescent lights at the Briar Glen Animal Rescue flickered twice before settling into their nightly hum. That low, electric murmur that made every shadow in the corridor stretch just a little longer. It was the kind of sound a person stopped hearing after a week on the job. But for the animals behind those metal doors, it never faded. It was the clock they lived by, the signal that another day had passed without change. Cage 402 sat at the far end of the east corridor, wedged between a storage closet and a wall vent that rattled when the heat kicked on. Not the best spot, not the worst, just forgotten. The kind of place staff walked past on autopilot, clipboard in hand, eyes already scanning the next row. Inside that cage, pressed into the deepest corner behind a folded grey blanket, a small tortoiseshell cat named Jane had turned invisibility into an art form. She was not feral. The intake report made that clear. No hissing, no scratching, no lunging. Her teeth had never made contact with a single gloved hand. She had simply decided not to exist in the presence of others. The moment a footstep echoed too close, her body would flatten against the back panel, her amber eyes would widen into two perfect circles of alarm, and her breathing would go so shallow that a person might genuinely wonder if she had stopped altogether. The staff at Briar Glen had seen shy cats before. They had protocols, slow blinks from a distance, treats left at the edge of the cage without making eye contact. Soft classical music piped through a small speaker near the door. Patience, repetition, time. None of it worked on Jane. Months passed. 3, then 4, then 5. The volunteers rotated. The seasonal fosters came and went. Kittens arrived in cardboard boxes and left in the arms of families within days. But Jane remained, a permanent resident of Cage 402, eating just enough to stay alive, rearranging her blanket with a quiet, almost ritualistic precision that suggested something still burned inside her. Some small pilot light of will that refused to go out, even as everything else in her behavior screamed surrender. "She eats when no one is looking," said Delia Marsh, the shelter's senior behaviorist, during a Tuesday morning staff meeting. Delia was a tall woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses perpetually perched on her forehead and a voice that carried the calm authority of someone who had spent 30 years interpreting the silence of frightened animals. "She drinks. She grooms. She is not shutting down. She is choosing not to engage." "So what do we do?" asked Marcus, a young technician who had been assigned to the East Corridor for the past 2 months. Delia removed her glasses from her forehead, cleaned them on her sleeve, and placed them back in the exact same spot. "We wait." "For what?" She did not answer right away. She looked at the chart on the wall. Jane's chart, a grid of tiny check marks and dashes that told the story of a creature caught between survival and surrender. For whatever it is she is waiting for. That answer satisfied no one. But in a shelter that handled over 400 animals a year, there was only so much time and emotional bandwidth anyone could dedicate to a single cat who refused to be helped. Jane was fed. She was monitored. She was safe. And she was alone until the second week of October, when a man no one particularly noticed began cleaning cages in the East Corridor. His name was Calum Virek. He had arrived on a Monday, escorted by a county liaison officer who handed over a single sheet of paper and left without small talk. Community service, a minor infraction, something bureaucratic, a missed court date that snowballed into a mandated number of hours that needed to be fulfilled somewhere, anywhere, as long as it involved showing up and doing something useful. Briar Glen needed hands. Calum needed hours. The arrangement was transactional, and that suited him perfectly. He was not young and not old, somewhere in the territory of his mid-40s, with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of quiet detachment, not unkind, but not inviting. His hair was cropped short, peppered with early grey. His hands were large and moved with a mechanical efficiency that suggested years of physical work. He spoke to the staff only when spoken to, responded with nods more often than words, and never once asked for a break. He cleaned cages. He refilled water bowls. He swept the corridors. He hauled bags of litter and kibble from the storage room without complaint. And he talked to himself, not loudly, Not in full sentences even, it was more like a low, continuous murmur. A thread of sound that ran beneath everything he did, the way a river runs beneath a bridge. Words, half-words, fragments of thought spoken to no one in particular. A habit, perhaps the only remaining evidence of a life that had once included someone to talk to. No one paid attention to it. The shelter was full of sounds: barking, meowing, the clang of metal, the hiss of cleaning spray. One more voice in the background registered as nothing. But on the second day of Caleb's assignment, something happened in cage 402 that had not happened in 5 months. Jane lifted her head. Not all the way, not dramatically. Just a tilt, a slight rotation of her ears toward the corridor, followed by a fractional rise of her chin from the blanket. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before she pressed herself flat again. Marcus noticed it only because he happened to be charting her food intake at that exact moment. He blinked, checked the clock, and wrote a single word in the margin of the log: responsive. He did not think much of it. Cats had good days and bad days. A head lift meant nothing on its own. But it was not nothing. And by the end of that week, everyone in the East Corridor would know it. By the 5th day, the pattern was undeniable. Every afternoon, between 3:15 and 3:40, the window of time when Kylem Virek worked his way down the East Corridor with a mop and a bucket of diluted disinfectant, Jane did something extraordinary. She appeared. Not fully, not boldly, but visibly. Her body would shift forward in the cage, away from the back panel, closer to the center. Her eyes, still enormous with caution, would track the sound of his voice as it drifted through the metal doors and tile walls like smoke through a keyhole. He never stopped in front of her cage. He never looked directly at her. He did not even seem aware she was there. He just moved through the space with that low, constant murmur, and something in her responded. "It is the frequency," Delia said on Friday afternoon, standing outside cage 402 with her arms crossed and her glasses, predictably, on her forehead. She had been watching the security camera footage from the corridor for the past 2 days, rewinding the same 30-second clips over and over. His voice sits in a very specific range. Low, steady, no variation in pitch, no sudden spikes. It is almost monotone, but not flat. There is warmth in it, just no urgency. Marcus leaned against the wall. "So we record him and play it back." "We tried that." "And?" Delia shook her head slowly. "Nothing." She went straight to the back corner. This was the part that unsettled everyone. If it was simply a matter of sound frequency, a recording should have worked. If it were about volume, they could have calibrated that. If it were about rhythm, they could have mimicked it. But Jane did not respond to a reproduction of the voice. She responded to the voice itself, and everything that came with it. The weight of the footsteps, the slight scuff of the mop handle against the floor, the pauses between words, the absence of expectation. Kylem Virek was not trying to reach her. He was not trying to reach anyone. He was simply present. And that presence carried a quality so rare in a shelter environment that it might as well have been a different language. No performance, no agenda, no hope directed at her, just existence moving through a hallway, talking to the air. Jane recognized something in that. What it was, precisely, no one could say. But it was real, and it was hers alone to interpret. "We cannot force this," Delia told the team the following Monday. "Whatever is happening between that man and that cat is not something we built. It is not part of the protocol. It is something that occurred on its own, and our job now is to not break it." So they stepped back. They adjusted the cleaning schedule so Kylem's corridor time remained consistent. They reduced foot traffic in the East Wing during his shift. They did not tell him what was happening, partly because they did not want to alter his behavior, and partly because no one was quite sure how to explain it. A cat that has been catatonic for 5 months is responding to your voice was not exactly casual conversation. Meanwhile, Jane continued her quiet transformation. By the end of the second week, she was no longer just appearing. She was waiting. Before his footsteps even reached the corridor, before the first syllable of his murmured monologue drifted through the air, she would move to the front of the cage and sit perfectly still, facing the door. Not meowing, not pawing at the bars, just sitting, alert, patient, as if she had made a decision about something and was now simply honoring it. On a Wednesday evening after his shift, Caleb paused near the supply closet to return the mop. The corridor was quiet. Most of the staff had gone home. The overhead lights had already been dimmed to their nighttime setting, casting long amber rectangles across the floor. He was about to leave when he heard it, a sound so small it barely qualified as one, a soft, breathy chirp. The kind of noise a cat makes, not to communicate, but to acknowledge. To say, without saying, "I know you are there." He turned his head. Jane was pressed against the cage door, not hiding, not retreating. Pressed forward, her whiskers touching the metal, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, because that was what he always did. Looked away from things that asked too much of him. But as he walked toward the exit, his murmur, that low, involuntary thread of sound, continued, and it carried something new in it, something even he might not have recognized, a tremor. The Briar Glen Autumn Harvest Fair was a tradition older than most of the people who attended it. Every November, the town square filled with folding tables covered in checkered cloths, trays of cinnamon-dusted apple cake, jars of honey with handwritten labels, and enough knitted scarves to outfit a small army. There was a pie contest, a raffle for a handmade quilt, and a brass band that played the same 6 songs every year with unwavering commitment. It was also the shelter's biggest fundraising opportunity. Delia had organized a display near the bandstand, a table with pamphlets, donation jars, and a rotating slideshow of animals available for adoption. The photos were carefully chosen, bright eyes, playful poses, the kind of images that made people reach for their wallets before their brains caught up. Jane's photo was among them. It had been taken weeks earlier, during one of her rare moments of visibility. Her face illuminated by the corridor light, her amber eyes catching the glow with an almost golden warmth. She looked, in that single frozen instant, like a cat someone could love. Not a project, not a case study, just a cat. "We need the community to see her," Delia had argued during the planning meeting. "Funding keeps her alive. Awareness keeps us open. We cannot protect her in a vacuum." The logic was sound. The execution was careful. The intention was kind, but no one accounted for what would happen when the fair ended and the world shifted. Volunteers who had attended the event came back energized, full of stories and laughter. They moved through the shelter with a different energy, faster, louder, more animated. Doors opened and closed with less caution. Conversations carried down hallways that were usually silent. The heating system, which had been partially shut down during the outdoor event, kicked back on with a deep mechanical groan that vibrated through the walls. For most of the animals, it was a minor disruption. A day or two of adjustment, then back to normal. For Jane, it was a catastrophe. She did not retreat to the back of the cage. She retreated further than that, into a space that seemed to exist only inside herself. Her body curled into the tightest possible shape, pressed into the corner where the wall met the floor, her face turned away from the light. She stopped eating. She stopped drinking. She stopped rearranging her blanket. She stopped doing the small, stubborn things that had always signaled she was still in there, still fighting. For 3 days, she did nothing. Marcus checked on her every 4 hours. Vitals were stable, technically, but the stillness was different this time. It was not the cautious stillness of a cat choosing not to engage. It was the heavy, leaden stillness of something that had given up trying to choose at all. On the second day, Delia stood outside cage 402 for a long time without speaking. Then she said very quietly, to no one, "We pushed too fast." The guilt was immediate and shared. Everyone on the team felt it, the weight of good intentions gone wrong. They had wanted to help Jane by making her visible. Instead, they had made her world unpredictable, and unpredictability was the one thing she could not survive. Kylam arrived for his shift that afternoon. No one told him what had happened. He walked to the east corridor with his mop and bucket, began his routine, and started his murmur. Jane did not move. He passed her cage once, twice, 3 times over the course of the afternoon. His voice filled the hallway the way it always did, low, unhurried, asking nothing. She did not respond. He finished his shift. He returned the mop. He left, The next day, the same, and the day after. By the fourth day, a quiet despair had settled over the east corridor. Marcus had stopped writing notes in the margin of the log. Delia had requested a veterinary consult to discuss supportive care options, which was the clinical way of saying we might be losing her. And then, on the fifth morning, something. The food dish, which had been untouched for nearly a week, showed a small disturbance. A few kibbles had been moved, not eaten exactly, displaced, as if something had nudged them, tested them, considered them. It was not recovery. It was not even close. But it was motion where there had been none. And in the grammar of shelter life, that tiny shift was the difference between a period and an ellipsis. Jane was not done. She was deciding. And later, that same afternoon, when Caleb's voice drifted through the corridor for the 15th time since her collapse, her ear twitched. Just once. Just barely. But it twitched toward the sound, and not away from it. Delia, watching the footage later that night in her office, pressed pause on that frame and stared at it for a long time. A single ear, tilted 2 degrees to the left, frozen in the blue light of the monitor. She removed her glasses from her forehead, set them on the desk, and leaned back in her chair. "There you are," she whispered. Winter arrived the way it always did in Briar Glen. Not all at once, but in layers. First, the mornings turned sharp, the kind of cold that bit through jacket collars and made the tips of ears burn. Then the trees along Maple Street dropped their last leaves in a single overnight surrender, leaving the sidewalks buried under a carpet of brown and gold. Then the frost, thin at first, painting the windows of the shelter in delicate patterns that the morning sun would erase by 9, then thicker, more persistent, as if the season were settling in for a long stay. Inside the shelter, winter meant maintenance. The heating system, already temperamental in the best of months, required its annual overhaul. Pipes were inspected. Ducts were cleaned. 2 of the older units in the East Wing were replaced entirely. A process that involved 3 days of drilling, the sharp smell of sealant, and a rotating cast of workers who moved through the corridors with heavy boots and louder voices. For Jane, it was another earthquake. She regressed. Not as deeply as before. She still ate, though less. She still drank. But the tentative progress of the previous weeks dissolved. She no longer waited at the front of the cage. She no longer tracked the sound of Caleb's voice with that quiet, expectant stillness. She was back in the corner, back behind the blanket, back in the country of her own fear. Delia watched it happen with the exhausted calm of someone who understood that healing was not a straight line. "She will come back," she told Marcus, though her voice carried less certainty than her words. "She has done it before. And if she does not?" Delia adjusted her glasses. "Then we keep showing up anyway. That is the job." But there was another problem now, one that had nothing to do with construction noise or heating ducts. Caleb's hours were running out. He had arrived in early October with a specific number of community service hours to complete. By mid-December, the count was nearly at 0. His obligation to Briar Glen was ending, and with it, his reason to walk through the East Corridor every afternoon with a mop in his hand and a murmur on his lips. No one had discussed this openly. It hovered over the team like weather, something everyone could feel, but no one wanted to name. Delia finally addressed it on a Thursday during a brief conversation with the shelter director, a practical woman named Helen Foss, who managed budgets and building codes with equal efficiency. "Can we offer him a volunteer position?" Delia asked. Helen looked up from her spreadsheet. "Has he expressed interest?" "No." "Has he expressed interest in anything?" Delia paused. "He shows up. He does his work. He leaves. He does not linger." That does not sound like a man who wants to stay. It did not, and Delia knew it. Caleb Virek moved through the shelter the way he moved through everything. Brahmashayat Sain, though, with the careful, detached efficiency of someone who had trained himself not to invest in places he would eventually have to leave. He did not ask about the animals. He did not learn their names. He did not stop to pet the kittens in the front room or laugh when the old beagle in Kennel 12 howled along with the radio. He just worked and talked to himself and left, but there was that tremor, that small, barely perceptible crack in his voice on the night Jane had chirped at him through the bars. Delia had not imagined it. She had heard it on the audio playback, a single vibration in a frequency that had been, until that moment, perfectly controlled. Something had moved in him, whether he acknowledged it or not. On his second-to-last day, Kylam finished his shift 20 minutes early. He returned the cleaning supplies, signed the log, and walked toward the exit. His footsteps were steady, unhurried, the rhythm of a man completing a task. He reached the door. He stopped. For nearly a full minute, he stood with his hand on the push bar, staring at the scuffed tile floor. His lips moved slightly. That murmur again, though quieter now, almost subterranean. Whatever argument was happening inside him, it played out entirely in silence. Then he turned around and walked back down the east corridor. The lights were already dimmed. The nighttime hum had settled in. The corridor smelled of pine cleaner and dry kibble and the faint mineral tang of winter air leaking through a window seal that had never quite been fixed. He stopped in front of cage 402. He did not kneel. He did not reach through the bars. He did not call her name. He simply stood there and let his voice do what it had always done. Fill the space without filling it up. Low, grave, steady, unhurried, words about nothing. Fragments of thoughts that meant everything and nothing at all. The kind of talk a person has with the empty rooms of their own life when they think no one is listening. The seconds passed. 10, 20, a minute. And then, from the darkest corner of cage 402, a shape emerged. Jane moved slowly, carefully. Each step, a negotiation between the part of her that wanted to disappear and the part of her that was tired, so deeply tired, of disappearing. She reached the front of the cage. She pressed her small body against the metal bars, and she stayed, not asking, not seeking, not performing, just present. In the same way, he was present. Two creatures standing on opposite sides of a door, neither of them sure how to open it, but both of them choosing, for the first time in a very long time, not to walk away. Kylam's voice faltered. The murmur cracked. He swallowed once, hard, and closed his eyes. When he opened them, she was still there. He left that night without signing any paperwork, without making any promises, without telling anyone what had happened in the dim corridor of the East Wing at 7:43 on a Tuesday in December. But the next morning, when Helen Foss arrived at her desk, there was a voicemail on the shelter's answering machine. A low voice, measured, careful, asking about the process for adoption. The house sat on the edge of Millbrook Lane, a narrow road on the quieter side of town where the houses were small and the yards were wide, and the nearest neighbor was a retired postal worker named Edna, who grew tomatoes the size of softballs and waved at everyone whether she knew them or not. It was not a remarkable house, single story, white siding that had turned a soft ivory with age, a porch that listed slightly to the left, as if the whole structure had exhaled and never quite straightened up again. The front window looked out onto a line of birch trees whose branches, bare now in the deep of winter, scratched against the glass when the wind picked up. Inside it was warm, sparse but warm. A couch with a knitted blanket folded over one arm. A kitchen table with two chairs, though only one showed signs of use. A radio on the counter, tuned to a station that played old standards at a volume so low the music was more texture than sound. This was Kylam's home, the place he returned to each night after leaving the shelter, the place he had lived alone for longer than he cared to count. It was clean, organized, and utterly silent in the way that only a house with one occupant can be. Until now, the carrier sat on the living room floor, its wire door open, inside a folded towel. The same grey blanket from cage 402, which Delia had insisted he take. She knows this, Delia had said, pressing the fabric into his hands with the quiet urgency of a woman entrusting someone with something holy. The smell matters. The texture matters. Do not wash it. He had not washed it. Jane had not left the carrier. 3 hours passed, then 4. The winter light shifted from pale white to amber to the deep blue of early evening. Kylam sat on the couch, not reading, not watching television, not doing anything except existing in the room with the steady patience of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that waiting was its own form of action. He murmured, not to her, not to anyone, just the murmur. That old habit, that low river of sound that had become, without his permission, the bridge between his world and hers. At some point, he could not say exactly when, a small nose appeared at the edge of the carrier opening. It twitched once, twice, testing the air for threats, for chemicals, for the sharp electric signatures of danger. Finding none, it retreated. 20 minutes later, it appeared again, this time accompanied by 2 amber eyes and the delicate outline of whiskers. Jane looked at the room the way a traveler looks at a foreign country, with wonder and suspicion in equal measure. The couch, the window, the strange soft light, the absence of metal, the absence of echoes. She did not leave the carrier that night, but she did not turn away from the opening either. She slept with her face tilted toward the room, toward the sound of his breathing on the couch where he had chosen to stay instead of retreating to the bedroom. In the morning, he found her sitting just outside the carrier on the towel, perfectly still, watching the birch branches move against the window glass. He did not react. He walked to the kitchen. He made coffee, he murmured. She watched him for 11 minutes. He knew because the clock on the wall was the only ornament in the room. And then she walked, slowly, to the space beneath the kitchen table and sat down, not hiding, not fleeing, choosing a spot. The days that followed were slow, deliberate, unremarkable to anyone who might have observed them from the outside. A man in a quiet house, a cat in a quiet house, 2 lives running on parallel tracks, close enough to hear each other, not yet close enough to touch. Jane explored the house in stages. The first week, she claimed the space under the kitchen table. The second week, she ventured to the hallway, where a heating vent near the floor sent up warm currents that ruffled her fur. By the third week, she had discovered the windowsill in the living room, wide enough for her to sit and watch the birds that gathered on the birch branches in the mornings, their small bodies like dark notes on a white staff. She still flinched at sudden sounds. She still retreated when the mail carrier knocked or when the wind slammed a branch against the side of the house. Her nervous system carried the memory of fear the way old wood carries the memory of water. Warped, permanent, but not fatal. Kylam did not push. He did not try to pet her. He did not sit on the floor beside her with treats in his palm, performing the theater of patience. He simply lived his life and let her live hers, in the same space, at the same pace, until the boundary between them grew thin enough to see through. It happened on a Saturday evening in late January. The house was dark except for the warm glow of the kitchen light. The radio played something slow and old, a song with a melody that circled back on itself like a conversation between friends who never needed to finish their sentences. Kylam sat at the table with a cup of tea and a crossword puzzle he had been working on for 3 days, not because it was difficult, but because he had nowhere to be and nothing to rush toward. Jane was on the windowsill. She had been there since mid-afternoon, watching the last of the daylight fade into the blue-gray palette of winter dusk. The birch trees were still. The street was empty. The world outside the window had gone quiet in that deep, settled way that only small towns achieve on cold Saturday nights. She turned her head, looked at him, and then, with no urgency and no hesitation, she jumped down from the windowsill, crossed the living room floor, walked into the kitchen, and stopped beside his chair. Not under the table, not at a safe distance. Beside him, she sat. She looked up. Her amber eyes caught the kitchen light and held it. 2 small lanterns in the dim room. Kylam set down his pen. He looked at her for a long moment. His murmur had stopped. The house was completely silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant music from the radio. He lowered his hand, not reaching, not offering, just lowering it, letting gravity do the work. Jane leaned forward. She pressed the top of her head against his knuckles, lightly, briefly, and then pulled back. She did not run. She looked at him again, as if checking that the world had not ended because of what she had just done. It had not. She leaned in again. This time she stayed. The warmth of her head against his hand, the vibration of a purr so faint it was barely more than a thought. The ghost of a sound that had been locked away for so long it had almost forgotten how to exist. Kylam did not move. He did not speak. He sat perfectly still while something inside him, something old, something heavy, something he had carried alone for more years than he wanted to count, shifted, not broke, not healed, Just shifted, like a door that had been stuck for years, finally giving way. Not swinging open, but admitting at last that it could. Jane purred. It was the first time anyone had heard her make that sound. The weeks turned. February arrived with its short days and long shadows. Then March, with its false promises of spring and its stubborn, persistent cold. Edna from next door brought over a jar of tomato preserves and asked about the cat she had seen in the window. She is shy, Caleb said. It was the most words he had spoken to a neighbor in years. She looks content, Edna said. He thought about that word for a long time after she left. Content. Not healed, not fixed, not transformed into something she was never meant to be. Just content, settled, present. Alive in a way that was not about surviving anymore, but about staying. Because staying had become, for the first time, a choice worth making. And every evening, without fail, the routine repeated itself. Kylam would sit at the kitchen table. The radio would play. The light would dim, and Jane would come. She still hesitated at the edge of the kitchen, still paused, one paw lifted, ears swiveling, reading the air for signals only she could interpret. But she came, and she stayed. And in that small house on the quiet edge of town, where the birch trees tapped against the window and the radio played songs that no one remembered the names of anymore, two creatures who had forgotten how to share a space with another living thing remembered it together. Not because someone taught them, not because the world became less frightening, but because they discovered, slowly, imperfectly, in their own stubborn and particular way, that the opposite of fear is not courage, it is trust. And trust does not arrive with fanfare or revelation. It arrives the way winter turns to spring in a small town, so gradually that no one can point to the exact moment it happened. One day there is frost on the window, the next there is not. One day the branches are bare, the next the smallest green bud appears, barely visible, easily missed, but undeniably, irreversibly alive. Some hearts are not meant to be rescued. They are meant to be waited for, and some voices, low, imperfect, speaking to no one in particular, become the only sound in the world that says, you do not have to disappear anymore. You can stay.